Hey, what's going on, craft beer professionals? My name is Chris Klein with Cascade Floors Inc., and we are proud members and sponsors of the CBP. Some of you know me, but for those who don't, I look forward to meeting you someday. If you run a brewery or a food production facility, you know your floors take a serious beating every single day. Well, that's where we come in. Cascade Floors has been in business for over 55 years. We bring over 200 years of combined experience to your job site every day. We never outsource labor. Our crews are full-time trained professionals. We have over 4.5 million square feet installed at over 480 breweries in 34 states and 3 countries. Those floors take a serious beating every day. Our floors are designed to handle tough conditions and withstand chemicals and hot water washdowns and serious heavy equipment use. Our floors are 100% non-prorated, 5-year warranty against debonding. If you're planning a new building, expanding, or just tired of patching those crappy floors, hit me up. We'd love to work with you.
All right. Hey, everyone. Nate Ferguson here from Escarpment Laboratories, and wanted to give a big thanks out to craft beer professionals for giving us a chance to chat with you guys. So today we're going to talk about lager yeast history. This is part of originally our lager yeast series, but we thought we'd do a little redo on it and share it with everybody. So today we're talking about the science and history of lager production. Could be good. So a little background as to who I am. My name is Nate Ferguson. I'm one of the co-founders of Escarpment Laboratories, as well as one of the professors here, which is where I am right now at Niagara College, for the Brewmaster and Brewery Operations program, where I've been teaching here for nearly 15 years. Now, this content is technically outside of my teaching, but it does show a very strong personal desire that I and Escarpment Labs has to share brewing knowledge with the people for free. We want, and my goal is to provide free, accessible insights into brewing science, techniques, methods, anything that we think brewers will need in order to improve the quality of their beer for free. That's what we do. Now, to emphasize this or help facilitate this, if you go onto our website, we have a knowledge base. It has over 80 entries, including strain-specific yeast strain data or nutrient profiles required. If you go to our YouTube page, we have over 50 hours of content on there, including our Yeast Basics series, which is our most popular video. We'll be referencing some other videos throughout today's presentation on there. We also have a podcast and blog, where the podcast has been one of the newest things we started to do with my business partner, Richard and Mark, and it's excellent. I recommend you check it out. So a little bit more about today. So today we're going to be talking about lagering models or methods. So everything we're talking about today I need to make sure we're all aware that this is a template or kind of a basic structure. My goal today is to explain the different aspects of these different methods. Like you can choose what makes the most sense for you. So feel free as we're going through these models today, to kind of pick and choose which parts you want to work with. My hope is that by the end of this, you understand why certain models or why certain methods for making lagers will work in your situation. So let's meet the models. We have a few basic models. We have our classic Czech, which I'm going to call our SDJ method for reasons we'll talk about soon. This is the classic kind of Pilsner or Kell style method. We then have Narcissus, which we'll talk about Narcissus a lot. This is kind of the Bavarian standard, post-World War II standard, which is now used by Hofbrauhaus, Weihenstephan, all the kind of the big German classic continental brewers. We then have our macro methods. These are your Budweisers, Coors Lights, Millers, the big macros. And then we kind of have our crafty / modern Czech, which is our modern kind of version. Just kind of pick and choose his methods as they see fit. Now, this is what all these models look like, side by side. And we're going to go through each one of these kind of step by step. The big thing I want to emphasize here is just that there are a lot of differences. If you go online, you start trying to figure out, how does brewery ABC make their lager, or how does brewery B make their lager? You're going to see different temperatures, different zones, different techniques. They are different, and they all have different goals. And then my hope today is that we kind of show you how these different methods influence the different goals. Now, there are other models that we're not talking about today, not because they're not important, not because they're not used. They're kind of separate. We can kind of use the models we're talking about today to explain these other ones too. We kind of have our Northern German, which is kind of like half Narcissus, half macro. We have our ultra cold polishing, which is even kind of a colder version of our classic Czech, which does pull some macro elements into it too. And then we have our pseudo lagers, our kolsches. This is kind of our warmer fermentation temperatures, but similar, post fermentation handling to what we see today. There are other methods. We're just not going to talk about every single one. And the main reason for all of this is why you should care. For those who don't know, this is from a kids show, Bluey. My kids like it a lot. Many brewers get confused with all these different kind of methods in there, and they'll say, hey, we need to lager the beer for 4 weeks. Why? Well, because that's how the classic Germans do it. But why do they do it for 4 weeks? That time is a lot of money, and I've seen brewers have the ownership or have the production manager stare at them, being like, "We're doing what now? Why do you want to lager your beer for 8 weeks?" It's very important that we understand the reasons why we need to do these things and not just do them for the sake of tradition. Time is money, and if we waste time, we are wasting our ability to generate money. So, hopefully, giving you the knowledge puts the tools in your hands to make the best decision. So if you wanted a quick TLDR on this and about why these different methods exist or why you may choose one over the other or where these methods come from, it's this. The SDG method is our lowest tech method. It is one of the oldest methods that we're going to talk about today. It requires, very low tech because that's the level of technology relative to today that was occurred when these beers are made. NARS is kind of our medium tech. Most breweries have the requirements NARS is stated in their breweries. This was the next kind of technological progression when it came to beer manufacturing. And then macro is high tech. A lot of breweries don't even have the tools, techniques, equipment, centrifuges, things like that required for macro level brewery. The infrastructure just isn't there. So some of these things for macro breweries, we just can't really install. We can't really do in a standard craft brewery. So to explain all this, we're going to talk a little bit about why we lager and then talk about the history of lagers and then break each one of these different methods into it. So lagering is, or the reason we lager, the reason we even just cold condition our beer, which lagering is the process typically of laying down or cold conditioning our product. The reason we do this is we're trying to have certain flavor compounds that were produced during fermentation get cleaned up, either through sedimentation or through yeast respiration, consuming that product back up like diacetyl. We're also trying to settle out solids and improve clarity. And this is the one that I think most people overlook the most. They overlook the desire for, say, cold break to be created due to cold conditioning inside the beer to settle out to make the beer's body lighter. This is the part that I find most brewers miss. So to explain this evolution, let's look at the history of different lager techniques. I think starting with the history and kind of using history to couch these conversations is one of the best ways to do it. So if we were to look at a rough timeline, I do mean a rough, oversimplified timeline, traditional cellaring for lagering really didn't start until about the 1800s. Before that point, records were scarce, there just wasn't a lot of detail available or record keeping available for a lot of these different things. However, in the 1830s to 60s, this really changed at Spaten Brewery. And Spaten Brewery is often credited with being one of the first breweries or the first brewery in Germany to start using lager yeast. Now, they didn't really know they were using lager yeast. They just had a yeast strain that performed better under these cold conditions, and they loved it. They started making a beer, the Vienna-style lager, which then influenced other brewers like those at Pilsner Urquell to make the Pilsner, which is the progenitor of almost every single macro beer we have today. We then saw this technique, emphasized by an individual called Ludwig Narses. Sorry, my German pronunciation is not great, but he really influenced from a technology standpoint how the brewing of these Pilsner beers could be enhanced or changed. And then from like the late 80s, early 90s until the modern era, we have the macro brewery phenomenon where we start seeing mass industrialization and improvements, air quotes, of this style of beer into what we now have today. That's an oversimplified version, so let's get into the details. So the first place we have to look at is what beer was like before any of this industrialization or macro brewing, pre-lager, so to speak, occurred. And the biggest thing here is that this was alcohol production mainly facilitated by monasteries or churches. There's almost no record keeping of this style of beer. All we know is that fermentation temperatures were cool. The time was highly variable. We didn't know that yeast was a thing at this point. It was just kind of the fermentation lees sometimes caused rapid fermentation. Lager temperatures were whatever the cellar was. That's it. And lagering time was 0 to 6 months, 2 to 6 months. At this point, beer wasn't really it wasn't a sellable product. It was a provisional product. You needed it in order to survive the winter. It was available calories. That was the big thing. If you didn't have beer, you were probably not going to survive the winter. So that was why we were there making beer. It was sustenance. However, this all really changed. This monastic period shattered with Napoleon Bonaparte. I am simplifying a lot of things there, but this was one of these big shakeups. Napoleon essentially broke the entire Holy Roman Empire, which kept all this area together. We're not going to go into what the Holy Roman Empire was. I almost said Napoleon Dynamite. Just in the chat. My bad. Napoleon Bonaparte. After Napoleon fell, the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806 was formed, and then finally the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which created kind of what we now call the Austrian Empire. And this was a really important deal. And if you were to look at kind of a map of Europe today versus a map of Europe then, the biggest thing you'll notice is that all these prominent brewing areas, minus Bavaria, we're talking Czech Republic, Austria, even little parts of Germany, northern Germany, were a part of this Austrian Empire. And the Austrian Empire, plus a little bit outside of it, the important thing to mention here is that there weren't any trade barriers. There weren't any language barriers. These were really all a part of the same country. So when we start using terms like, Czech brewers or Austrian brewers or Bavarian brewers, German brewers, this doesn't really make sense in a historical context because there weren't barriers there. There wasn't a border there for information to be, stopped. This area had easy communication, easy trade amongst every single one of these regions. So a brewer in Austria could easily take, a one-day cart ride up to Pilsen or horse ride up to Pilsen and start talking to brewers there the next day. These are far closer in geography and in borders and in language than we kind of often think about in a modern context. So how did this all start? How did we kind of start seeing this evolution or this modernization of brewing? Well, one of the first people, and I'm not saying it was the first, but one of the first that we have kind of one of the largest corpuses of information from is an individual whose name I am unfortunately probably not going to say correctly, but his name is František André Pupe. I usually end up just calling him Pupe. And he published in 1801 The Art of Brewing Physically, Chemically, and Economically. And many consider this to be one of the first brewing textbooks that existed. This is the important part. Utilizing thermometers and hydrometers, two pieces of equipment that we now think of as commonplace, rote, just of course you're going to have this equipment with you. But in 1801, these were revolutionary instruments. These were not commonplace. They're also much more expensive than what we'd have today. So Pupe was one of the first people that tried to get people and share the information about why hydrometers and thermometers were useful for brewing and how they could be incorporated to make alcohol for the masses. Very, very important. Again, very basic for what we think about today, but historically, this was huge, absolutely huge. Now, and then in 1839, we have the next kind of individual to come onto the scene for our purposes. And this is Anton Dreher. Now, he, along with one of his compatriots we'll talk about soon, traveled to England and Scotland in late 1838, along with Gabriel Sidmeyer. Sorry, this is right here is Sidmeyer. Anton Dreher is the next slide. Where they learned about pale malting technology. Now, this is really important because before this point, most beers were dark. They were looks like porters or mild. They were much, amber to a dark brown in color. However, with the invention of these, the incorporation of this English and Scottish tech to make lighter malts, we started seeing the ability to make lighter colored beers increase. Now, Sidmeyer is known for the Munich Dunkel, and he's published and for the pushing for the uses of lighter kiln malts along with Dreher. This push for kind of the Dunkel and then the use of lighter malts allowed for us to start creating some of the styles that we think of today. Which then brings us to Dreher. So Anton Dreher invented the Vienna lager, originally called a Marzen or a March beer, which is where we believe we get that name for the Marzen or March beer come around. In around 1840, he created it. Now, unlike Sidmeyer, Dreher was more of a businessman. He helped spread the word of lager brewing and this kind of new methods in Austria and further afar. But he was really more of a businessman. He liked to own the breweries, not necessarily work inside of them, apparently. Now, he purchased the Kobania brewery in 1862 before his sudden unfortunate death. This brewery then expanded into Hungary, where it's still apparently a commonplace beer. I've never been to Hungary, but from what I can tell, it was still common. One important thing I didn't mention about Siddelmeier is that Siddelmeier also helped establish the Weinstefan Institute, which is German's, I'd say, premier brewing school that's still active to this day. These two had a huge impact on just, I'd say, establishing the basics, the foundations of modern German-style brewing. They encouraged breweries to use these new lighter kiln malts, monitoring methods. They also adapted new lagering equipment outlined by Pupe, being the hydrometer and the thermometer. They're also some people that started to push for the use of this new yeast strain they kept on finding, which is at Spaten, the lager yeast. All these things combined, this kind of ecosystem started creating what we now think of as lagers in a modern context. And then we have the first Pilsner. So in 1838, based on some of the research and the publications of Siddelmeier and Dreher, I remember these people are all functionally in the same country. They're all within a one-day ride with each other. They're in communication with each other. There are apparently some excerpts from this. I don't speak German, so I'm going based on what others have told me on that. But in 1838, based on all this information, a brewer in the Czech Republic, the town was not happy with their beer, and they wanted to build a new brewery and hire a new brewer. And they ended up hiring the Bavarian brewer, Joseph Groll. Again, just like a 1 or 2 day horse ride away, not super far. On October 5th, 1842, Groll brewed the world's first pale lager, Pilsner Urquell, using local soft water, Bavarian-style malted barley, which was influenced by Siddelmeier and Groll's tech for light kiln malt, Saaz hops because they were native to the region, and Bavarian lager yeast, which was originally invented by Spaten, along while using hydrometers and thermometers that were originally pushed by Pupe. And this is where the Pilsner was born. This is arguably the first Pilsner that was ever produced. Now, we know a little bit about what was used for these original beers. They all were fermented around 6 to 8 degrees Celsius, so quite cold in a modern context. A little bit about this. So the thermometers they were using, back in the at this time period, they were not as accurate as what we'd have today. A modern day thermometer, your phone probably does it, would be far more accurate than what they are working with today. So control within like 2 to 4 degrees Celsius is excellent. We're not going to see fermentation temperatures between 7 and 8 degrees C. It's going to be a much larger range. The fermentation time was highly variable. It's also poorly documented. We don't know exactly how long that was. We know they lager between 0 and 4 degrees C, which we'll get to in a second. Excuse me. And the lagering time was somewhere between 3 to 6 months, mainly due to mechanical limitations. That's where the next part kind of comes in. So these three, being Siddelmeier, Dreher, and Groll, really took the influential work that Pupe laid out and kind of formed the foundations of what became kind of modern lager brewing that lasted pretty much all the way up until post-World War II. These three, and the lager making methods outlined by these three, the kind of the classic Czech method, or what I like to call the SDG method for Siddelmeier, Dreher, and Groll, really is the foundation of what you see some brewers do. And some brewers still hold this. A lot of the Czech brewers still hold this method. Some of the more, I'd say, classic or older German-style brewers will use this method. Maybe not for everything, but for a handful of their products. The SDG method is still used, which is why you'll see some brewers say they need to, lager their beer for X number of weeks, where this other brewery does it for, 2, and they do it for 8. This is where we start seeing some of these differences occur, partially due to tradition. So just to kind of give another lens for this, we kind of, all these people, to quote Isaac Newton, if I've seen further, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants. That's really what's happening here. Pupe promoted the measurement devices and allowed for this tech to be spread over, large regions. Siddelmeier and Dreher adopted scientific methods, added decoction and indirect fire kiln malting, allowing for dark beers to turn into less dark and amber. Groll then combined all these different teachings, the influence from the Vienna malts, or the Vienna from Austria, and created what we now think of as the Pilsner. They all kind of merged and combined into what we now think of. And this is what it looks like. So the beer would start around 6 degrees Celsius. It would then ramp up, naturally up to around, give or take 10, maybe a bit colder, maybe a bit hotter. Hold there until fermentation was nearly finished. Then slowly crash, hold around 4 degrees C, maybe crash again. it really depends on the facility, but roughly this is the method for it. Now, a few reasons for this. Now, a cold start is a very common technique you'll see used in a lot of this brewing for practical limitations, practical reasons, and for yeast cell health. Yeast cells don't typically like being chilled. They like being warmed. So if we start colder and then raise them up in temperature, they tend to do better than if we were to start warmer and cool them down. We typically want to always raise the temperature for yeast cells, not cool. This would then be allowed, fermentation would be allowed to complete until the beer is finished and conditioned. Now, just a few concepts for this, a few really important kind of limitations that's important to be there. So for wort cooling, they didn't really have many options. It's cold outside, and if there's ice nearby, they could cool their wort. If it wasn't, they wouldn't really have the ability to cool their wort down further. This is before glycol systems. This is before even ammonia-based systems that you saw like around World War II era or before. Like this is very, very basic, rudimentary. It's cold outside, therefore we can brew. For transferring, they had rudimentary hoses. The kind of common brewery hoses or water hoses that we think of today wouldn't have been abundantly available. Most of the hoses of this time are literally made of animals, intestines and things like that. They're not the standard rubber polymers that we'd have today. Again, for mashing, thermometers are pretty new. They wouldn't have had stainless mash tuns. It's wooden mash tuns with, basic valving, and valving being very expensive. A very different kind of just brewing environment than we think of today. Now, there's another big thing for here, and this is where we start seeing some regional deviations or regional differences in lagering times. Classic lagering times, and you'll still see this today with certain, these regional breweries, is that Bavarian brewers or South German brewers would typically lager their beers for 4 to 8 weeks. Vienna or Austria would be 6 to 10 weeks, and Pilsen would be the longest ones, like Pilsner or Kel or Czechvar, Budvar, depends where you are. They'll call it different things. They'll go 90 days or 8 to 12 weeks. Why? Well, if we look at the length of the winters, this just makes a lot of pragmatic sense. In Bavaria, they have about 3.5 months or so where the temperature outside's negative 3.5 or below C. In Vienna, it held around negative 3 degrees Celsius. About 3 months of negative 1 degree Celsius. However, there's a lot more lakes nearby where they would haul and pull ice out of these lakes, just kind of like the beginning of Frozen. I have children; these are my references. Where they're hauling ice out of the lake to cool down other things. They had more access to it. In Pilsen, because it's in the mountains and higher up in elevation, they would have about 4 months of negative 5 degrees Celsius environment, which meant they could simply lager the beers for longer. It's especially true for the Czechs, but a lot of this traditional lagering time we see wasn't due to some sort of desired product or end result. A lot of it has to do, arguably, just due to how long their winter was. That's how long they lagered their beer for, was however long they could, and this was how long their winter was. So that's how long they lagered it for. There's a bit of certainty on that it isn't 100%, but that seems to be why a lot of these beer styles had differences. Yeah, Czech, long cold winters. Germany, shorter, warmer. That's about it. And yeah, we do see some beers like Czechvar, have that traditional 90 days of cold. Now, there's a great video on this. I'm gonna share, tell you about it. I think it's Craft Beer and Brewing. They have a 2-part, 3-hour tour in English of Czechvar. And it's great. It's phenomenal. And even one of the brewers in that video, I think it was in that video, or it might have been accompanying documents for it, even said they do this 90-day lagering for tradition. A lot of the benefits are achieved much sooner than 90 days, but they mainly do the 90 days between 0 and negative 2 degrees Celsius for traditional purposes, not necessarily for anything else. So tweezing out what brewers do for tradition versus purpose saves us money. So that brings the end of the SDJ method. This went all the way up into World War I, even World War II. These advances of technology, which is an unfortunate kind of part of war. War almost always increases the available tech. We started seeing a lot of this available tech that was produced for military efforts start to then post World War II be incorporated into day-to-day operations. And that's where we enter our next era, or our Narcissus era. I like to think of Narcissus as the modernizer of the industry. So Dr. Ludwig Narses, I'm sorry if I'm saying that correctly, but it's how I've been saying it my entire professional life, was a professor at Weihenstephan Institute, also known as the Beer Pope, who published many papers and methods on modern lager production. And through the adaptation his main kind of ethos, his driving force was through the adaptation of technologies and systems, fermentation, maturation, and clarification could be sped up or refined without sacrificing quality. His goal really was to modernize lager brewing, and that's what I'd say he quite successfully did. Now, he was trying to achieve a few things in this post-World War II, just to kind of break them out a bit more. He, wanted to improve consistency and predictability. If he couldn't do that, modernization or industrialization wasn't really possible. He wanted to increase throughput without sacrificing quality. He identified that the SDG method had a lot of these things that were done for tradition and not necessarily done for practical reasons. Sometimes they achieved outputs, but they weren't necessarily done for that intent. He wanted to optimize flavor development through understanding of biochemistry or the biochemical pathways, one of the things that we do at Escarpment quite often. He also wanted to formalize handling and flocculation of yeast, which we're not going to talk about today, but I thank him a lot because a lot of these initial texts were influenced at least by him. And he wanted to standardize brewing science for teaching and for the industry. Narses was one of the big people that kind of really pushed brewing from an art form into the scientific realm. And for all these reasons, for a lot of reasons, we owe him a great deal of thanks. There are not enough Americans, in my opinion, that know who this guy was. So how to do this? Well, his methods were formalized in his book. Sorry, my German is not great, but Abriss der Brewery, or an outline of brewing, which was published initially in 1976 as a completed work. However, there were early versions of this text as early as the late 1950s. This was and has been an evolving resource, originally telling people how to construct solenoids on their own before solenoids were originally and easily accessible, and to later versions that just say use solenoids. This is the level of detail that some of the original versions of this book were going into. So his methods built on the traditional practices, the SDG method, and really pushed them towards more of a systemic process control. He introduced temperature ramps, diacetyl arrests, yeast behavior monitoring, and kind of clarity-focused maturation, as well as step cooling, which I'll talk about in a second. So his method, simplified, is the following. Inoculate around 7 degrees Celsius, ramp up anywhere between 8 and 14 C. If you want the yeast strains to be a bit more expressive, a bit more fruity or estery, go to 14. If you want more reserved and cleaner, go the colder 8 to 10. If the beer needs a diacetyl arrest, so if you have any of that, buttered popcorn or butterscotch, or even if you do a forced diacetyl test, which you can learn about on our website, and you get a positive for it, you can do an optional diacetyl arrest between 18 and 20 degrees Celsius for 1 to 2 days. He did suggest only to do so if it was absolutely required, because it would damage the sulfur profile of the beer. He then recommended that you step crash down to 4 degrees Celsius, decreasing no more than 1 to 2 degrees Celsius per day for reasons we'll talk about in a second. And then lager between 0 and 2 degrees Celsius for 3 to 6 weeks. Longer durations for higher ABV beers and lower durations for lower ABV beers. Beer at this point was not left to climate. We had glycol chillers, or things that allowed for controlled cooling and progressions. Everything in this point was controlled. Everything could be optimized according to him. And this is just visually what the method roughly looks like. We start around 4 to 7 degrees Celsius, slow ramp up, hold until fermentation is mainly done, a optional diacetyl arrest if required, only if required, and then a slow, steady decrease in temperature down to about 4 degrees Celsius. So Narses' methods really hinged upon the available technology of the day. We started talking about the SDG method, like thermometers were new, hydrometers were new. Like we didn't know what yeast was at this point. Like that's the tech that we're seeing. With Narses, we started seeing new technology being adapted and influenced inside the brewery. So just some kind of standards for it. Temperature control really wasn't available in commercialized settings until 1930s to 50s, and it wasn't really cost effective until the 70s. CCV usage, or conical fermenters, were available in the 70s and 80s for large breweries, but for the small guys, it wasn't even like the early 2000s or late 90s where it became easily accessible. Closed CO2 purges, a common thing we think of today, just using compressed CO2 to get rid of the O2 in a tank. That wasn't something that was really available until the early 70s and available widely until the late 90s. Like some of these things that we now think of as a standard protocol just weren't available to most breweries. And this is the sort of thing that Narcissus was trying to help breweries fix, or help breweries adapt and push into their facilities to improve the quality of their beer. Now, just a little quick aside, Narcissus was one of the biggest pushers for making sure people understood that yeast was a thing in its most basic format. He was one of the, I don't know if he was actually a part of it, but the original Reinheitsgebot didn't, or the German beer purity law, Bavarian beer purity law, didn't originally include yeast inside of the things that could be allowed in beer, because we didn't know yeast was a thing. But he really pushed this to be an important thing that brewers considered. One of his quotes, roughly translated from the German, was that yeast is not merely a biological agent, but a fundamental raw material. Its handling must be controlled, measured, and understood. Only then can consistent quality and efficient production be achieved. To my knowledge, he was one of the first brewers, scientist brewers, however you want to look at him, that encouraged people to really look at yeast cell health, something that we now kind of think of as commonplace or basic. But before this point, this didn't exist. He really helped push this into the setting. He pushed the principle that yeast contribution to flavor, and that its pitch rate, vitality, etc., impacted the beer. We didn't know this, so I owe him a great deal of thanks on this part alone. So a few of the bits for this. The shift from the SDG method to Narcissus was the ability to highly control our process. So a few bits for this. Why 7 degrees Celsius start? So as I said before, yeast cells don't like being chilled. They like being warmed. He also showed that this improved the yeast cell's health. He showed that colder starter temps suppressed esters and aldehydes, which are both very important for lagers. Colder than this temperature caused the fermentation to be too slow or have a very delayed onset of fermentation. So 7 degrees C seems to be that kind of happy middle, cold enough to inhibit aldehydes, while warm enough where we don't see kind of excess delays in fermentations beginning. Now, the range of 18 to 14 is a range, and it's a bit of a bigger range for fermentation to occur, but it's important. Now, he suggested a ramp up of no more than 1 degree Celsius per day, which is hard to achieve for most. This would mean that we start around 7, and then by 1 week later, we're at around 14. Now, there's also some documents. He says that if you want a cleaner beer, keep at a colder temperature. Don't necessarily go to 14, but go to maybe 12 or 10 or something like that. It just all depends on what kind of fermentation flavor you eventually want it to be produced. So many people fermenting these beers would stop at a lower temperature. This would mean a longer time for total fermentation and a greater chance of diacetyl being present. If we ramped up higher, we're going to have a greater reabsorption of diacetyl and a faster fermentation. Now, I'm not going to say there is no right or wrong answer to this. I'll default to Thomas Sowell on this, where very famously said, and that's what I say a lot in my classes, is that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. There is no perfect answer to this. If we do this, something else is going to shift in regards to it. Our goal is to try and find the best trade-off for our situation. So you can choose what temperature you want. And the other part here is the optimized diacetyl rest. Diacetyl is going to depend on our mashing methods, which will influence our amino acid profile, our fermentation temperature, pitch rates, all that good stuff. Now, Narcissus, to my knowledge, was the first German brewer to push for a diacetyl rest, if needed, which was a gentle rise of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius per day, up to around 18 C. Not all went to 18. Higher temps typically flashed off some positive sulfur tones, which would damage the beer. So he usually suggested only to do it if needed. Only if needed. If your beer did not have a diacetyl issue, do not do this rest. This was only if the beer was needed. There's also some secondhand people who had had conversation with him, some records of this, where he said, if you have diacetyl in your beer, that suggests that you messed something up. Something went wrong. If you want to see more information on this, we have a whole video on understand diacetyl you can see on our YouTube page. But diacetyl is really just the result of a lack of valine inside the fermentation or a lack of a certain amino acid. So if you didn't give or a lack of decoction, or lack of, just providing nutrition to the yeast. If your yeast cells are producing diacetyl, that means something else went wrong. So that diacetyl is there to help clean things up, but the brewer should be focused on preventing the cleanup from being needed in the first place. Easier said than done, but that's where he landed. Yeah, we talked about that part already. And why step crashing? So we have a whole. You're going to hear me say this a lot, but I have a whole separate video on this in our lagering series, all about clarity for step crashing. And step crashing really does do a lot of heavy lifting for this. Step crashing does seem slow. We're going to be going 1 to 2 degrees Celsius per day, which does seem like, most breweries go from fermentation temperatures down to, 0 to 2 degrees Celsius in a single day. There is a bit of, having to go slow to go fast with this. The slower we cold crash our beer, typically the faster we see things come out. The first one is it prevents thermal shock. So when we have our yeast cells at these colder temperatures and we slowly cool them, it actually allows the yeast cells to produce more flocculin protein, which then allows for the more rapid or more complete sedimentation out of the beer. Optimal flocculation temperatures for ale yeast, not for lager, is between 10 and 14 C. For lager yeast, these genes are kind of damaged, so it doesn't work nearly as well. But we do see a step crash typically result in a more complete sedimentation. Same thing goes for proteins. For proteins, we see step crashing, work better for settling out for settling out molecules that make chill haze. It allows more tighter kind of flocculation between all the bits. I had a student use this analogy for it, so I'm going to steal it because I think it's great. It's kind of like Tetris. So when we first start playing Tetris, all the parts move down slowly, and it's easier for us to align all the pieces to make a nice, tight, compact area. However, when the music speeds up after we've been playing a while, it becomes harder for us to match everything into the places it's supposed to go because it's moving so much faster. When we cold crash our beer quickly, going to say 14C to 2C, that's like the Tetris when it's going very fast. It's very hard for all the yeast cells and protein to settle out into where we want them to go. We start seeing gaps form inside of the cake, inside of the proteins. They start binding to things they wouldn't normally bind to, creating waste. When we slow crash the beer, we're essentially playing Tetris on slow speed, and we can make sure everything gets tightly compact away where it needs to go. I like the analogy. So we just talked about that. If you want more on this, we have a whole video on clarity for loggers that you can go check out. So yeah, another big thing for this is the ability for chill haze. So this is a classic. I remember seeing this like 10, 15 years ago, where it was all about chill haze. So chill haze is a phenomenon where when the beer is at warm temperatures or just room temperature, the beer is nice and clear. However, when we cool the beer down, we start seeing it become hazy. What's happening here is that certain mainly proteins, but also some polyphenols, as we cool the beer down, the ability for the water to keep things dissolved decreases. This is why if we're trying to make simple syrups or dissolve something in water, we use warm water. Trying to rinse things off, it's better to use warm water. The same thing happens here. At warmer temperatures, these proteins become soluble. Now, at colder temperatures, the opposite happens, and we start seeing some of these molecules come out. And as they come out of suspension, and then more importantly, as they settle out, we see an overall reduction in protein content for the beer. So classically, if you're looking at some of even the SDG brewers, this is where we'd see kind of one of the goals of flocculation occur or of lagering would occur. So as this kind of chill haze occurs, once it occurs and becomes out of the solution, it will then slowly start to settle. And when we start seeing brewers talk about 4-week or 6-week lagering times, what they're really looking for is they're looking for that chill haze to occur. Usually takes a week or two, and then that chill haze to settle out and compact at the bottom of the tank, making the beer lighter, drier, and crisper due to less protein being in the beer because it fell out with the chill haze. Bit of an in-depth on this. If you want more information on this, you can see our YouTube page. We have a whole video just talking about this. Now, unfortunately, NARS was born pre-World War II. He died on the 29th of November in 2022 at the age of 97. Narcissus was a formative figure in the brewing and beverage technology space. He didn't just work he mainly worked in beer, but not just in beer. He is known throughout the world, whole world, for his expertise in brewing. We owe him a great deal of thanks and respect for the things he contributed to our industry for over 40 year of his over 40-year career. Really kind of a titan when it came to brewing science in our industry. So just thank you. Now this now brings us to our macro traditions. Now I like to use this example of the banana art to talk about macro brewing. If we're looking for what the brewers are trying to achieve, most German brewers want flavorful, delicate beers with character that's easy to drink and is quite refined. The macro brewers are looking for easy drinking, less complex, super clean, and fast products. This difference in goal is very important because it really illustrates how we think about quality. And quality is kind of a funny thing in that it's subjective. Like this picture on the right, some people will swear that this banana with duct tape is art. I think it's silly, but some people will swear that this is a very high-end level of art. Art is subjective. Quality is subjective. So when we start talking about these improvements, or air quote improvements, they're improvements to a goal, being easier drinking, less complex, super clean, fast beer. The techniques we're going to talk about, if you want to do that, this is how you got to do it. There's almost no other way around it. So where did this start? The use of adjuncts is arguably considered to be one of the things that really separates North American style brewing and the rest of the world, or German style brewing. North America kind of is known for using these adjunct heavy malts or adjunct heavy worts in their production. So where'd this come from? Well, this was created in New York by Anton Schwarz, who was a Czech-born citizen, a Czech-born Austrian. There we go. An Austrian who lived in the Czech Republic. His family then immigrated to New York. Who was the editor of the American Brewer, or at the time it was a German publication. I'm not going to try to pronunciate that, where he really pushed for the use of adjuncts. He suggested that the use of adjuncts would improve foam and allowed for the use of cheaper six-row barley that grew much more prominently and abundantly in North America. By the turn of the century, this became normal. He started saying in 1880 that the people should be doing this. By the turn of the century, this is how most North American brewers worked with. They used either corn or rice plus the six-row barley to make beer. Now, when it comes to the use of either corn or rice, this is an oversimplified version of this. Very oversimplified. Again, we have more information coming online. But the reason they do it is that these grains, corn and rice, have a lower protein content in wort typically. This results in less yeast growth and therefore less ester production. The more the yeast cells grow, the more ester production we tend to see. Less protein also lightens the body of the beer, making them thinner and crisper. Those are two things that sometimes are bad, thinner and crisper, lighter, drier, but sometimes they're phenomenal. In this case, they're great. Now, corn tends to provide a bit more sweetness to the beer, while rice tends to be a bit more neutral. I'm not going to say one's better than the other, but they do have their differences. So this then turns us to post-World War II. Post-World War II, all North American beer was brewed similar to the Germans. Narcissus/SDG method was the norm. They adopted all the technologies pushed by Narcissus. You start even seeing old copies of his texts in North America. But they had to find ways to further kind of improve the beer without sacrificing quality as per their consumer. Quality, again, is subjective. And this is where we start seeing some of the things we talk about today when it comes to macro brewing, mainly high gravity brewing. Now, for those who don't know, high gravity brewing is making if you're trying to brew a 4 or 5% beer, we do not brew it at 5%. We brew it at 9% or 8% or 10%, just a higher alcohol content. And then we add water back to it to get it down to, say, our 4 or 5%. This has a huge impact because I can now, with the same equipment, produce a 9% beer where before I was making a 5% beer, essentially increasing my production by about 40% without investing anything into stainless steel. It's huge, absolutely huge. Revolutionized the way in which North American style breweries operate. Now, this tech really started in the 1950s to the 70s. Many U.S. breweries began trialing high-gravity brewing for their products. Again, they were drinking about a 15 to 20 degree Plato wort, finished fermentation around 7 to 9% ABV, and then diluting it with water. There are some records of this. Narcissus was cautious about high-gravity brewing, seeing it as sacrificing quality for yield. I'm not going to weigh into that one. I'm not going to weigh in, but it occurred. Now, this picture on the right is a pilot plant at Heriot Watt in Scotland, so the UK, that was mainly focused on high gravity brewing, and it was run by this fellow. His name is Dr. Graham Stewart. Still, to my knowledge, still alive to this day. I had a nice 5 or 6 years ago. I had a chance to chat with him for over an hour, and it was eye opening on certain things. Absolutely excellent. Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Dr. Stewart. There we go. He pushed a lot of kind of the standards that we see today that became very popular, especially in the 80s, late 80s, due to its efficiency. You started seeing functionally every single macro brewery adopting these techniques, making 9% beer, then diluting it down to 4 or 5%. There isn't one exact method. One exact person who invented this method. It really was a network of different breweries, not as big as we have today, but their earlier forms, all working on this method and sharing information, allowing for high gravity brewing to become the norm like it is today. Now, how it looks is very different than what we'd see today, or what Narcissus recommended. They would ferment their beers initially around 12 degrees Celsius. They'd then let it sit there for about a day or two, and then quickly ramp up to about 15, let it ferment out, hit FG as fast as they could. They didn't want to go to those higher temperatures at first because they'd see enhanced diacetyl and aldehydes and ester production. So by keeping it slightly colder at first, they would see cleaner fermentations. After 15 or so, after the fermentation nearly finishes, they then cold crash the beer down to about 0 or 4 degrees Celsius, with some even going below 0, which we'll talk about in a second. At which point they'd lager until the beer was clear. That's really about it. Now, the goal here was high throughput of a neutral tasting, off flavor free light lager that could be consumed by all. They're just looking for 0 flavors as much as they possibly could. Now, there were a lot of technological advancements at play. This might seem like an easy shift, but there's a lot of other changes that occurred. The first one being that the beer was aggressively filtered. This is where we started seeing 0.2 micron or lower filters being used to help make the beer clearer, faster, lighter, faster, all that stuff. Additionally, yeast was selected to become more neutral. The yeast strains became smoother, easier, lighter. This is where our Corona-style yeasts or Mexican lager, North American-style lager strains come from. They're all bred to be neutral. Also, the final beer is roughly 1/3 water. And to my knowledge, water is the most water-like tasting substance we're going to find. So if we want the beer to be lighter, thinner, drier, more like water, one of the best ways to achieve that is adding water. So any sort of off flavor we would have, or any sort of flavor compound we would have, positive or negative, would be diluted by about 1/3 simply due to the method, which is going to make these beers lighter, drier, cleaner, crisper, all that good stuff. And on top of this, everything is highly dialed in. The high gravity brewing is where we started to see, full PLCs, programmable logical computers. I think I have that right. The C I'm a little iffy on. Being used for brewing to control and automate every single process to dial things in. Now, there were also some other differences. I think the other presentations I've given, if you want to look at a video on fermentation geometry, we have it on our website, on our YouTube page. Taller tanks do apply hydrostatic pressure, functionally causing the cells to act like they're fermenting colder. So these tanks were fermenting hotter, about 12 degrees C. But we started seeing the shift from a horizontal tank to a vertical tank, which when we have that shift, that extra pressure, it kind of treats the yeast cells like they were fermenting at 7. So 7 degrees Celsius in a horizontal tank is kind of similar to 12 degrees Celsius in a 60-foot tall or 5-story tall tank. There's no direct linear correlation between these two, but this is absolutely a thing that we started to see change with high gravity brewing that influenced the flavor. There's other bits here too. Due to the higher ABV of the beer being around 9%, you'd see brewers bring the beer below 0. So the freezing point of alcohol at about 5% is about negative 2.5 C. So if we bring it, close to 2, we're going to see some freezing. However, if we bring it, say, an 8 or 9% beer, well, the freezing point is going to be, negative 3.8 to 4 degrees Celsius. This means that we could bring the beer down to, say, negative 2 degrees Celsius very confidently without there being any sort of freezing or damages. What this will cause is that chill haze we saw before. The chill haze will form much more rapidly and much more completely than it would otherwise if we had kept it, say, at positive 2 degrees Celsius. The ability to bring the beer colder allowed for, more rapid or ice conditioning, as we sometimes saw this called, of the beer. Now, if you want to do this yourself, it's very important you remove the yeast cells first. You have to do at least a coarse filter to remove the yeast cells for here. Otherwise, you will freeze the yeast cells, creating autolytic tones. So don't do that. There are literally research papers on this. And then finally, a cold filtration step. You'd see these beers go down to like negative 2 degrees Celsius or negative 3 degrees Celsius, and then filtered aggressively again, just to try and clear out that protein, that chill haze, remove even more protein from the beer, just to make the beer lighter, drier, crisper, faster. That faster part is important. So there's other notable macrobrewery influences on here. That's just to note. Joseph Oades, I actually don't know how to say that properly. From 1960 to 70, he was really pushed the use of enzymes to further dry out the beer and decrease the cost of it, to really optimize its production. Dr. Charles Bamforth, who's still in the industry today, last I checked, he worked for Sierra Nevada Brewing. He is also known as the Pope of Foam, worked at UC Davis for a long time, focused heavily on beer stability and process consistency. There's also Dr. Michael J. Lewis, who founded the UC Davis, University of California, Davis campus, if I recall correctly, their brewing science program. And he's one of the people who also promoted high gravity brewing and its methods and research. There's lots of things in here when we look at high gravity brewing. We have to kind of think of, are the things that were done by these previous people a tradition, or were they pragmatic? Was there a reason? And if it is a tradition, is that tradition worthwhile to hold? High gravity brewers, or these macro brewers, were really aggressive in answering this question. And sometimes I'd say, yeah, some of these things were just done for tradition and didn't have any impact. Other times it was huge. A great example for this, I think, is just talking about fermenters is, I can't say about other places in North America, but at least the Budweiser that was fermented in Ontario 5 to 10 years ago had to exclusively be fermented in horizontal fermenters in order to make sure the yeast strain flavors were correct. They found if they moved the tank from horizontal fermenters to vertical fermenters, it didn't taste right. They didn't know why, but they didn't like it as much. Sometimes these traditional elements have a reason, have a purpose. Sometimes they don't. And if you find yourself in like a high throughput facility, asking this question is a really good idea. All assuming the beer quality stays where you want it to be. So yeah, all these individuals pushed lager brewing forward. Poupe pushed for thermometers, hydrometers. One thing I didn't really emphasize is that for Siddelmeyer, Dreher, and Grohl, they pushed for things like pumps, which were very new to brewing at this point. They didn't have access to them beforehand. The lagering tanks, horizontal tanks. Narcissus really pushed basic temperature control for PLCs, control systems, glycol chillers, CO2 purging, like these basic things we think about today. Grohl really pushed. And then the macro breweries took these things to the nth degree and created some crazy technologies that just allowed for rapid production. Some technologies or some methods are birthed out of tech limitations. Other ones are there for tradition. Line can be blurry, but it's your call. And that's kind of the story of lager. It's a dance between kind of these traditional practices that were established for, mechanical limitations or based on the technology of the time, and efficiency. These are 6 individuals that I think we owe a lot to when it comes to, modern day lager brewing. We owe them all a kind of a big bit of thanks. So there are a lot of things I left out, and there are a handful of things I had to simplify for this, just to keep it kind of within a decent timeline. So if you want to dig into these things, any of the resources I mentioned today, be it Poupe or Narcissus textbooks, I just highly recommend you go and look into if you want to dig into this. A handful of them are not in English. However, modern technology has made the translation very, very easy. When we see differences in fermentation temperatures, temperature control systems, keep these things in mind. Keep in mind, is this a pre-World War I and World War II method? Is it a post-World War II? Is this Narcissus influence? Is this SDG method influence? Is this macro influenced? I hope kind of the frames I gave you today will help you kind of better understand what it is, what data you're actually looking for, or what you're looking at. There is kind of a last one, and this is kind of our new check craft kind of method, which does exactly this. It pulls in some things from the macros, it pulls in some things from SDG, it pulls in some things from Narcissus, all to kind of try and create what they want, whether it's a more rapid product, a more traditional continental style lager. They're going to pick and choose the techniques they want to produce the product they desire, which often doesn't fit nicely into a category, and that's okay. The beer's good. The beer's good. Yeah, those are the different methods. Now, there are obviously a handful of topics that are missed here. Decoction brewing and its impact on all of this was completely not talked about. Some basics on this is that the SDG guys, they typically did double or triple decoction was common, mainly due to malt quality. Narcissus recommended a single or double decoction, mainly for body, mouthfeel, and flavor. High gravity brewings only does infusion mashing, and you'll often hear some of those guys say that decoction mashing adds nothing to the beer. It adds nothing to the beer if under their context, but under the previous context, it does add flavor, body, and mouthfeel. And for the modern check, anything goes. If you want more information on decoction brewing and its impact on fermentation, we have a whole YouTube video on that exact topic. And that's about it. Again, my name's Nate Ferguson. I'm here from Escarpment Laboratories and Niagara College. And if you guys want to learn more, we have lots of resources available. You can go to our knowledge base, you can go to our YouTube channel, or listen to our podcast, which has new episodes coming out about every week or so. And hope you guys learned a bunch. And thank you all for your time. Cheers.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this session, we'd love to see you in real life. We host in-person workshops across the country for craft beer professionals just like you that are held in some of the most exciting beer destinations around. These immersive events are designed to help you grow and connect with others. You'll meet peers from across the country and leave with actionable strategies for success. Connection has never been more important, and you can learn more at cbpconnects.com. Cheers. See you there.